Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I wanted to talk about cycles because it's easy to misunderstand them, to miscontextualize them. And we have to talk about the obvious. There are 120 encampments on various universities in the United States. What has started at elite schools has spread to the state flagship universities in most states. Some of the encampments were crushed by the cops within 24 hours. Some have reconvened several times. There are negotiations done at some campuses with some divestment from weapons and the West Bank being granted. Some of the students negotiators have rejected the offer. Others, it's no, there's no game. Meanwhile, there's legislation being passed to make criticizing Israel an act of anti-Semitism, more or less, which is an infringement of free speech for someone else's country, but not your own, which really is weird. So here we are. But I've been thinking about the cycles. A friend of mine pointed out to me, these freshmen who are sloppily, throwing around whatever settler colonial jargon that's come up, are they've gotten from a mixture of reading people who read Jay Sakai, reading actual settler colonial studies, like Gerald Horn and whatever they read on X or Twitter. It's easy to have contempt for them. The entire liberal media right now does. I think what they're doing is brave. I also think it started out as an elite game and showed you how fragile the elites really were. After all, this is an elite without taste and without a vision for the future. We know they don't have a vision for the future because they can't pass down their legacy. We know that because they have necromantic political candidates who might as well be undead. No social reproduction is being had by our elites. They're not that far-sighted anymore, despite all the helicopter parenting. And this has shown up that the conscience of the Democratic Party and all the rhetoric that has been coming out of there for the past 8 years really has been internalized by a lot of young people. Now, there's a lot of leftists who think we can rebuild the left off this. I don't know. The historical cycles around these movements is that wars end, genocides are stopped, are completed, geopolitical powers shift. It's very hard to have a left just on that, but since the left during the teens could not walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, there was very little discussion of foreign policy during the Trump administration. And in fact, as the Obama administration went on, we went from talking about the failures to end the Iraq and Afghanistan wars to totally normalizing them. But this is a long durée cycle and a short durée one. These freshmen are being led by seniors who themselves were freshmen when when Black Lives Matter 2.0 happened after the George Floyd death, which led to a bunch of insurrections, and we'll call them insurrections, across the United States, starting from the industrial and largely of color black cities and ending in the elite areas of the country on the coast. Now, that cycle is a long cycle. We've seen it over and over and over again. Sometimes the reverse is true. Occupy started out on the coastal cities and spread throughout the country in response to police crushing it, but it signaled the end of one left. The alter globalization anarchist left was actually liquidated by Occupy. Today, the Bernie Sanders left is over. It's Gen Z's game now, and they're going to have to decide what to do with it. A lot of them aren't going to stay left wing. We've already seen indications that young men under 27 are slightly more conservative than in the past, and there's general disgust with the Democratic Party. Good. Many of the youth organs are realizing, even people as anodyne as the college Democrats think they need to criticize their party leadership at this moment. Now, it would help that they'd have done that after the Democrats failed on literally every campaign promise they've ever fucking made. But nonetheless, I mean, they can't live up to the Paris Accords. They didn't try to do anything in regards to the Supreme Court. They rolled over at the state level because they didn't want federalism showdowns under this court. They have normalized Trump immigration policies and then allowed the right to move even further right on these issues. In fact, on almost every issue they promised, things got worse under the Biden administration because the action moved to the state level where there was less oversight, less resistance, and it was more effective. So yeah, Gen Z's mad. In so much they are paying attention at all. There's also evidence outside of Gaza that Gen Z is actually more depoliticized generation than millennials were at the same age. We're going to have to ask ourselves a lot about that, why it is and what it means. Nonetheless, we have cycles here. And indeed, war protests tend to inaugurate and consolidate left-wing movements. On my current set of essays that I'm writing for this book that I'm doing, I have noticed that the way things have gone after the Red Scare is that you have an inchoate, vaguely liberal left that has some Marxian ideas that then on campuses joins up with sects in response to foreign policy, Marxist sectarianism, they unify. And then when the foreign policy crisis is over and the economic stuff hits in, there's a movement to return to labor, etc. Things do not work out the way these activists thought they would because the unions have their own bureaucracies, the workers have their own needs, and a lot of the concerns of international policy do not directly affect them. And even in the case of Gaza, most people care. After all, a lot of people, even a lot of conservatives, are deeply disturbed by the images they're seeing out of Gaza. But they also don't necessarily feel like it's their fight. These younger people, for them it is. And that's inspiring, but it's also limited. After all, these 120 encampments came from the use of force, and this is a part of the cycle that people don't really love to talk about. But protests spread like this when they try to be suppressed by direct police force. Eventually, the police usually win in the long run, but in the short run, it spreads the protest throughout the country. This has happened multiple times in my lifetime, going all the way back to my memory to the response to the Rodney King riots, which in some ways was a catastrophic response, but it was like Black Lives Matter before that was a thing. I mean, we can go back to the Chicago and Rots riots, actually, for the first round of this. What is remarkable is how repetitive it is, and yet things are different. This looks like 1968 in a lot of ways. You have occupations at universities over foreign policy. It's likely to be heavily mythologized because it's going to involve a lot of people who are going to get reincorporated into the elite, and a lot of people who are not, who are going to be radicalized but shut out. Unlike the Occupy or BLM, this movement has clear objectives, ones that it's not likely to achieve on its own. The anti-war protesters do not achieve work on their own, but one that's maybe worth doing. This is inaugurating another round. And a lot of people who've tried on political ideologies the way people used to try on aesthetic band stuff in their teens are going to have to really figure out who and what they are. For us who are of the millennial and Gen X left, it's our time to teach but not be paternalistic. We're not going to be able to tell these young people what to do, and we shouldn't try to. But we should try to offer some fucking guidance about how we screwed up. Because we did. After all, it seems to me that the irony of the dirtbag left, in so much of that word has any purchase anymore, was that for all of its critique of the Democrats, it kept people wedded to it. That was a response also to the uncommitted campaign episode that I ran. I registered as a Democrat to vote against Democrats. I've registered strategically throughout my life. My voting registration doesn't mean anything. I get obnoxious texts from 4 different political parties because I've registered as them to do certain things specifically locally, depending on what needed to be done in a given election. I'm a free agent. There's no party that represents me. Why should I not be a free agent? There's no Labor Party in America, and there's definitely no Socialist Party that has candidates enough that I think has a viable option that isn't a protest vote. Although I will vote for socialist candidates as a protest vote all the time. So this leads you to a question: is how do you get this to last beyond the summer? Because we know that what's going to be used on these kids, and Biden administration seems to be gearing up to use the Department of Homeland Security on these encampments, is going to be pretty serious. It will probably not be as sloppy as Kent State, where you kill 4 relatively unpoliticized 20-year-olds. A lot of people have learned a lot of things since then, although Tom Cotton would love for that to happen. Tom Cotton's never met a protest that he didn't want to crush unless it was ones for his team. The blatant Smithian logic of American politics has actually showed how fragile elite consensus are, because sovereigns who do friend-enemy distinctions this blatantly are also weak sovereigns. And so we are faced with a structural conundrum. How is the state both so weak that it's freaking out over things that would be relatively minor in other circumstances, and yet also getting better and better at crushing these kinds of occupations that we've now seen many rounds of since the anti-war movement in 2004. In fact, we've had 20 years of ever-increasing protest strikes and occupations worldwide. And despite what communizationists like Joshua Clover have argued, the riot will lead us to communization, I see no evidence of any of that on the horizon. It's a lot of questions for us to answer. Not a lot of answers easily made. But it's our time to hand the torch down. It doesn't absolve us from responsibility, but most of us in my cohort are now aging into grifts, if we're honest. Or businesses that are honest at best, or educational projects, what I do here. And it is not clear to me that the U.S. left, because it's standing on Trump, will be able to pivot easily to an independent response to this. Most of the students are not activists in any coherent way. Yes, there are activists and agitators, as the newspapers like to call them, but most of the students aren't that. They're horrified by what they're seeing is, a mass shelling of a situation that looks a lot like what happened in Rafah, but over a long period of time. And the blatantness of these military actions has been kind of special. What used to freak people out from WikiLeaks and from Abu Ghraib leaks is now being commonly shared by the IDF on TikTok itself. No one's hiding anything anymore. The gloves of civility are off. If your question is always X or barbarism, the answer is almost always going to be, given current scenarios, most likely barbarism. So the question is, what happens next? I've already done an episode on the pivot. I don't know if it's going to come out before or after this, but there will be a need for these to pivot. These protest movements can't stay like this. They usually signal the beginning of one left and the end of another. The FDF was born and collapsed around one of these cycles. The DSA seems to be shrinking right now. We've seen a return of some of the sects from the aughts that were big in the anti-war movement coming back. But this also isn't really an anti-war movement. It doesn't have that coherent of an agenda yet. It doesn't really know what it's asking for. Yes, it's asking for divestment from Israel. So it's a large ask and a small ask. Unlike some of the demands from BLM, this one can be done relatively politically easily. In some states, anyway. There are states where BDS is outright made illegal. And there are other times where you would at least have to have a board formalize this response because of legal requirements, and students don't always understand that. And maybe they shouldn't care, but it is the de jure reality that they live in. But this is yet another turning of the wheel. This is why I talk about things in generations. It's not because the generations are inherently real. Yes, they were made up by advertisers, and sociologists pick them up as convenient mechanisms to talk about things. Absolutely. But you can see cycles through them. And there are some things that make this different from 1968 that we need to discuss. In 1968, the universities were expanding from the GI Bill. Today, universities are contracting from general lack of interest and concerns over their extreme cost. University students are also not, particularly at elite universities, less and less domestic. Diversity quotas have often been met by foreign students. You can maintain your elite standards and seem to be helping oppressed people if you take the oppressed people from the rich of far away. And all that will change the dynamics of how this plays out. There's a real threat of deportation hanging over some of these people's heads. A real threat that the government will approve less student visas, etc., etc. That's very different from 1968. Also, we've lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons for almost a century now. That's also different than 1968. There's no Soviet Union, and China's not playing the same kind of role, not trying to reestablish a common turn despite all talk about multipolarity. It's the poles for themselves. That's also different. So in ways that it rhymes, there's also ways that it is very, very different. There's also the tendency, both the response to this and in this itself, to degenerate into petty nationalisms. And what is the prime identity politics but nationalism, despite what all we talk about other forms of identity? It's all a real threat here. So these are cycles. We're in another one. But in some ways, we have to let it play out. After all, as much as I'm inclined to think protests don't work, the fact that the authorities are freaking out this much about this indicates something has shifted, and we need to understand what it is. And on that, like and subscribe, hit the bell. I have a Patreon. You can get membership for as little as $3, and that comes with, I think, an episode almost every day of something. So there's a lot of material there. There's something like 1,000 posts behind the Patreon wall, and you can have access to like 700 of them, most of the audio, for very, very cheap. And I would appreciate it if you did. But if you don't, that's also okay. This isn't, I don't like making money off talking about Palestine, but this is really talking about the American left response. So maybe that's also a fair retort. Anyway. I'd like to thank my Khan and Kahanans. There's a few new ones. So let me tell you. And that includes Little Toaster and Hunter M and Daryl C. Thank you for your support. Keep your peace. You're going to need it. Take care.